Yep, hi everybody, and thanks for tuning in to our brief overview of some of the main changes to the planning policy in Edinburgh right now, which is primarily going to focus on the City Plan 2030 consultation. Um, Myself, Grant Allen, Senior Planner with Graham and Sibbald, and my colleague Murray Rankin, also Senior Planner, is going to take you through what we think are some of the main points and the main areas of discussion in the next plan that's been proposed by the council. So I'll take you through some of the main points to start with. The next slide, please, Murray. Yes, so the proposed plan, which Edinburgh is calling City Plan 2030, opened for consultation on the 7th of November, and is scheduled to close in a few weeks on the 20th. This is obviously quite a key document for the city and follows the main issues report, which came out for consultation in January 2020, just before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. In that document, the main issues report set out the council's preferred policy ideas for the next local development plan, which we're discussing today. And many of the ideas contained in the MIR have now been taken forward by the council to this next stage. And this document sets out the council's preferred policy vision for planning and development in Edinburgh. Also really key to note is this document will guide planning, development and the industry for the next 10 years of the city, as opposed to what the development plan process goes through every 5 years. And this is a result of the changes made by the Planning Scotland Act in 2019. So yeah, just to reiterate, this document, once adopted, will be enforced for a period of 10 years. There will be various what the government are calling gate check mechanisms, but I think further detail on that still to be provided. So it's quite key if there's any comments, promotion, land allocations you want promoted, it's key to get these in now, as it's one of the last opportunities to do so. In terms of the actual content of the plan, it's quite bold targets and ideas, and quite timely following the COP26 conference, which just finished in Glasgow last month. It sets out the council's key strategy, its proposals, its policies, and some buzzwords you'll probably hear from Murray and myself is sustainable, net zero, low carbon, and so on. This is the kind of council's ambition, fitting in with the wider national strategy to lower emissions. So yes, to give you a flavour of what the council is looking to achieve, things like 20-minute walkable neighbourhoods, maximising the use of brownfield land, trying to ensure that all new buildings and new development is net zero and low carbon, and implementing further policies to try and help deal with climate change. As I said, it's quite timely considering what the world has just been attending Glasgow to talk about. Yes, so the council has set out 4 key aims or visions, as you can see on the screen right now, and it's our aim to briefly, hopefully briefly, go through each of these and the main policies that come under each of these aims. So the first one, if we go to the next slide, please, is what a sustainable city. And probably the big headline noteworthy news item for this is the council want to go for a brownfield only approach for new housing development sites, and probably, you know, for development overall, but also key for new housing sites is they want to go for a brownfield approach and develop on existing areas or vacant land, etc., etc. In theory and in principle, promoting the use of brownfield sites for development will assist the council in achieving a number of their ambitions. A number of these include maximising the city's land resources, creating mixed-use walkable communities, quite key, as well as ensuring their aim to ensure a higher density of development, directing development towards areas which already have the infrastructure and capacity to support proposals, and probably quite key for Edinburgh, protecting the green belt and surrounding countryside. So, great ideas in practice, but a number of things the council and developers and the public will have to consider is whether these allocated sites within the proposed plan are deliverable. As they are brownfield sites, it's going to be important to understand if they are free of constraints, and are they going to be located in areas where there is genuine market interest from developers and ergo the people who want to buy these houses. So a lot to consider, and I'm sure further detail will come out during after the consultation period from this. Quite key, something that Murray and I have read about, some statistics that have been sort of doing the rounds and been pointed out that some of these allocated, in these allocated sites, only 5 to roughly 10% are actually vacant. So, raises questions of how will these sites be acquired and how they will then be developed, and quite importantly, if the majority of these sites are already occupied, how are existing businesses and etc. going to be relocated to other sites in the city as they were required to do so. So yes, quite important and quite a key target for the council, but a lot of detail still to come out in the wash. The next couple of points kind of relating to that, quite technical and quite detailed, but I think it's worth just quickly trying to go over some of these. Policy Environment 7 requires, excuse me, that all detailed proposals involving the construction and change of use of all buildings incorporates reasonably practical measures to address the climate emergency and contribute towards sustainable living, which must be demonstrated through a sustainability statement. Developments involving new buildings must also set out how development has been designed to be of long life construction, has been designed for the future adaptation to different uses, and utilise construction materials that have low or negative greenhouse gas emissions. Change of use proposals must also demonstrate how they've been considered and integrated to increase resilience to future climate change and minimise greenhouse gas emissions through such things as energy efficiency improvements or low or zero carbon technology. And finally, as a requirement of this new policy, proposals involving the replacement of existing buildings will be expected to be accompanied by a carbon assessment, which will set out the whole life carbon footprint of the proposed development in comparison with the option of reusing the existing building to accommodate the proposed use. So if such an assessment shows that the new development wouldn't utilise new technologies or have a lower carbon footprint, the developer or the applicant will have to provide sufficient justification to show why that development should still go ahead and why it fits in with the wider ambitions of the plan. So yeah, quite a key new policy there for development in the city. And lastly, on this theme is Policy Environment 8, new sustainable buildings, and this follows the theme being established by the council, and that new buildings must demonstrate they've achieved a net zero level of operational greenhouse gas emissions, and where appropriate, green roofs have been provided and have a pitch capable of supporting these, as well as providing other such measures as wildlife habitat corridors and water attenuation schemes. So yeah, there's quite a key theme running through these new policies, and probably something to be aware of is that these new requirements for a lot of development in the city will likely require specialist input throughout the development process, and probably from an early stage in the concept design. But it's definitely worth having a look at the plan and going through these policies in more detail to get an idea of what's going to be needed. Yes, so on to the next theme is excuse me, the council's ambition to reduce private car travel and where you don't need a car to actually get around the city. And to touch upon something I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the council want to promote and create 20-minute neighbourhoods, and these are quite a prominent and key topic of discussion in the planning world right now. In Edinburgh Council, clearly want to try and implement this and take it forward and it certainly fits in with the brownfield agenda that the council are looking to take forward. Essentially, this concept looks to, or wants to, guide new development to locations already close to amenities and near active travel routes, and essentially where you live, you can work, live, shop, relax, enjoy leisure within a 20-minute radius of where you actually live, and therefore reduce private car travel to get anywhere else to do such things. So yeah, development will be supported where it can be demonstrated there's infrastructure capacity to absorb new development. And this includes, again, such things that will be found in the 20-minute neighbourhood as schools, healthcare, transport and green space, and so on. Another key proposal that's been taken forward is new housing density provisions, and the council want to clearly make, encourage development on brownfield land, encourage higher density development. So for housing proposals which are already allocated, they'll have to make sure that at least 65 dwellings per hectare can be achieved on the site's developable area. And this, again, to sum up, fits in with the brownfield sustainability net zero agenda, and something the council want to make clear in the document is that the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns we experienced have, to them, clearly highlighted the importance of having local amenities on your doorstep and having access to this going forward, and that's something they want to implement for the city. So yes, I'll pass on to Murray, who'll take you through the next kind of key themes.
Great, thanks very much, Grant. So unsurprisingly, housing is an area within the plan that's receiving quite a lot of scrutiny, given housing is a pretty contentious subject politically and socially. As Grant mentioned, the council has a brownfield only approach to allocating new sites within the proposed local development plan, and Edinburgh has set some pretty ambitious targets of completing about 19,500 open market and 17,300 affordable homes by 2032. However, some have raised concern that these targets aren't actually representative of housing demand in Edinburgh, particularly the affordable housing requirement is subject to some scrutiny in that regard. Shepherd and Wedderburn actually recently identified that the most recent housing need and demand assessment, which is an analysis that's used to identify how much housing is going to be needed in a local area over a specific amount of time, they identified that this assessment actually creates a need for 44,500 affordable homes in Edinburgh over a similar period, so similarly up to about 2032. So councils aren't actually obliged to meet this target explicitly for various reasons relating to resourcing and other matters related to that. But this is obviously a fairly sizable discrepancy between the identified demand and what the actual targeted delivery is. So, and additionally, as Grant mentioned previously, the brownfield only approach does seem to raise some concerns in relation to deliverability, particularly as he highlighted, about 5 to 10%, some are saying, of these sites aren't actually cleared. Sorry, only 5 to 10% are in fact cleared. The rest presumably have some form of building or infrastructure on them that might act as a development constraint. But moving on to the actual policies within the plan that Edinburgh Council are proposing to include, there's a few new provisions which are particularly pertinent and interesting and relevant to look at. So the first of these is Policy Housing 2, which shows that the affordable housing requirement for developments of 12 units or more is going up to 35%. It's currently 25%, and this is clearly where Edinburgh City Council see themselves getting quite a good chunk of those 17,300 affordable homes that they're going to need to deliver over the next decade and a bit. But obviously that's quite a sizable increase. It's a 10% increase from the 25% it is at the moment, and these new homes will have to be delivered in housing developments where they're attached as a condition of a legal agreement normally. So these are usually handed over to be managed by the local authority or a housing association, and clearly Edinburgh have identified a shortfall there that they're looking to address, and this policy is one way of doing that. The next one that is worth mentioning here is related to a range of residential types and sizes. That's policy housing 3. This policy it specifically mentions catering to larger families, perhaps speaking to a desire to have diverse housing development that provides for people at all stages of their lives, whether it be when they're younger and able to live alone, cohabiting, having a family, or even retirement. So this presumably means providing households where a number of adult children might still live at home, or perhaps an elderly relative moves in. But it's interesting to note that there's a particular emphasis on larger households in this policy, and encouraging housing that caters to that. So purpose-built student accommodation also gets a dedicated policy. Housing 6, that is. This requires new developments to provide suitable amenity space, and there's a limit also on the number of flats that are to be provided as studio flats, and this is just set at 10%. While it's not entirely clear what's meant by suitable amenity, it presumably means that this will be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and it's an attempt just to ensure high living standards in new student accommodation developments, and just ensure that these don't become a case of maximising the number of units on site, and things of that nature. So policy housing 7 is also included there. This is an interesting one. This is included to stem the loss of housing units to alternative uses. So on the surface, this seems to be targeted fairly generally, and could be to prevent housing being turned into shops or things like that. But reading between the lines, this is most likely an attempt to control the number of homes in Edinburgh that are being converted for short-term lets via platforms such as Airbnb. The issue of this in Edinburgh has been quite widely reported and documented, and it's quite well known. And this policy actually sets requirements that this should be more challenging to obtain planning consent to make this change, and therefore limiting the number of units that are being lost to Airbnb type uses. And finally, just moving on to perhaps one of the more striking and eyebrow-raising policies is policy economy 2. This is clearly an economic policy, but it's definitely worth highlighting in this section regarding residential development. This actually requires new commercial proposals on sites of 0.25 hectares or larger to provide 50% of the site for housing. The policy references that this should only be done where it's compatible, quote-unquote compatible use, but this is not really explained entirely what this will entail. Student accommodation is explicitly referenced, and it could presumably also include hotels, care homes, and some level of retail development as well. It seems to be an attempt to ingrain mixed-use neighbourhoods, specifically the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods that Grant mentioned earlier, and that this is currently gaining quite a lot of traction in Scottish national policy, and you can see it here trickling down into Edinburgh local planning policy. So it's kind of somewhat unclear how this is going to work in practice at the moment. It may be that the council is just opening themselves up to being inundated with feasibility reports of developments that are looking not to provide this requirement, but it's certainly an interesting policy, and it'll be intriguing to see how this is applied in the future. So just moving on now to the economic policies here. There are two policies that are particularly worth highlighting here, specifically policy economy 1, which gives support for new development that involves socially desirable uses of business. This is things like social enterprises or startups that are involved in addressing poverty and inequality, or involved with Edinburgh's vast range of cultural festivals, and also businesses that are involved in higher education and research, or the betterment of the city centre will be supported under this policy. So quite an interesting one there. And additionally, policy economy 7 is worth highlighting. This is a new addition that's actually illustrative of what appears to be the changing nature of retail and shopping habits, particularly those that have evolved over the last couple of years and that have been exacerbated during the pandemic. The policy promotes new locations for goods distribution hubs, larger ones being directed to industrial and business locations, and smaller neighbourhood scale operations being directed towards appropriate sites. So it's interesting to note that the inclusion of this policy it takes place alongside the retention of retail protection policies within the plan. So the council's perhaps adopting an approach that naturally this is a direction that retail is going in, and they're looking to leverage some level of control over the development of these distribution hubs and have a say in where and how they're located and how they're developed, while still protecting the town and local centre retail function, which has obviously been a long-standing desire of planning policy in Scotland. And that kind of brings us to the end. Not really anything else to cover now. I hope you've enjoyed this brief coverage of the Edinburgh City Plan 2030. As mentioned at the start, the closing date for consultation comments is December 20th. So if you'd like any information about making a submission to this, any more details about any of the content in the plan, please don't hesitate to get in touch with myself or Grant. Our details are on the screen right now. And yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care.
Bye.